Hey, we're glad to see you on our another shocking story. Enjoy watching. 5:30. The night shift was finally over, and Emmy was literally falling asleep. She sat on the couch in the resident's office, unseeing with eyes that seemed to have sand poured into them. She was trying to read a text message from Darwin that had arrived the night before. It was urgent that we talk. Now she'd have to explain to her fiancé that Emmy had spent her evening and most of the night in the operating room. Although the intern's job in the IQ wasn't easy for the girl, she liked it. Emmy pressed the call button under her beloved speaker and listened to the indifferent beeps for a long time. Obviously, Darwin was sound asleep. The girl exhaled noisily and stretched. She loved that wonderful feeling of accomplishment when a pleasant emotional and physical fatigue piled up after a successful operation, that she still had a few hours to sleep before heading home. And then that strange dream came again. Gloomy halls with high vaults and tapestries hung on the walls with images of some unfamiliar people, ancient decorations, a candelabrum with 1,000 burnt candles, a huge grand piano, and a woman in a long antique dress standing in the center of the room. Her face was thoroughbred, austere, seemed carved in stone, but it was beautiful. High cheekbones and huge eyes whose colors were impossible to see. The woman held out her palm to Emmy, on which rested a huge gold ring with a bright green stone. Emmy reached out to touch it, but then the phone rang, pulling the girl's consciousness from its sleepy captivity. It was Darwin. Emmy hastily pressed answer, and in a hoarse voice said, "Hello." She didn't even say hello. He informed her that he would be waiting for her in 40 minutes at a coffee shop near his work. He didn't pay attention to his own feelings of resentment. The girl quickly dropped her work suit, pulled on her favorite jeans with a t-shirt and windbreaker, and headed out to meet her lover. She just hastily buttoned up her windbreaker, for a real spring was raging outside. Darwin sat at a table by the window and stared thoughtfully to himself. He was drinking an espresso. "Hi." Emmy leaned over to him and left a light kiss on his pressed lips. "What's up?" "We need to talk," the guy said briefly, and didn't even look her in the eye. The girl sat down across from him, into him, and reached for the menu. But he stopped her hand. "I already ordered you a cappuccino. We won't be here long." The gold watch his parents gave him for his 30th birthday glittered on his hand. "But I could eat. I haven't had anything in my mouth since yesterday except a couple of apples," Emmy protested, looking questioningly into his favorite face and finding no warmth or tenderness in his expression. Their gazes finally met. There was a pause, which Darwin interrupted. "We cannot be together anymore." "No offense," he declared. "I love another girl and I want to be with her." The words came out of the blue. Emmy tried to comprehend them and couldn't. Her brain seemed to go silly. Her tongue refused to listen. Outside the window, people were walking down the street. The May sun was shining. Time stood still here in this quiet little cafe at the beginning of what promised to be a very, very warm day. And Emmy kept looking into Darwin's expressionless face, trying to find signs of the man who, only 24 hours ago, had hugged her goodbye before work and kissed her passionately in front of everyone. I don't understand." Her voice treacherously trembled. "What other girl?" "You know her," Darwin replied calmly, and took a sip of coffee. "Just let's not swear." "Okay, no scenes," Emmy repeated bluntly. Indeed, resentments of bitterness swept over her with such force that she even got a headache. Meanwhile, the waitress brought over a cup of steaming, fragrant cappuccino, and as it turned out, very handy. For in those 10 seconds, the girl managed to calm down a little. "So, who's the girl? And when did you start having these?" She couldn't find the words. "This relationship is 3 months old. There's just no way I could tell you. First the accident, your illness, then your dad's death. Something kept getting in the way." Emmy covered her eyes. Such humiliation was something she had never experienced before. When she opened them again with her side vision, She saw Miss Lana approaching them, and Emmy understood everything. This girl was the daughter of her artificial father's business partner, the sole heiress to the owner of a lucrative construction company, a real princess, a socialite, exactly what Mrs. Rhonda, Darwin's mother, would have wanted for her son. Emmy lifted her head and met Lana's gaze. It was winsome and defiant. Emmy, however, looked at her absent-mindedly and forced a chuckle out of herself. No one would see her tears. Certainly not this Barbie with her nails, hair, and eyelashes. Lana's moving in with me. Darwin apparently decided to be consistent and finish off his now ex-fiancée, one step at a time. I have some packing to do. Emmy tried to keep her voice firm, but it was treacherous. I'll take your things in my car. Where do you want it? Emmy stared into the void for a second, then slowly turned her head and met his eyes. Just get them out of the trunk. Get out of my life, she said in a tired voice. An hour later, she was sobbing in her mother's arms, in a small kitchen in a small apartment, where the kettle is on the stove and where she smells of childhood. It was a good thing it was Saturday and her mother's day off. Emmy wasn't an overly sentimental person, but at the moment this house, this place where she'd grown up, seemed the only island of escape from the rush of emotion, from the betrayal of the man she'd given 3 years of her life to. The past few months had been a shock to the girl. First, there had been a terrible accident in which she had almost died, and she needed a blood transfusion. This led to the discovery that she was not her parents' natural daughter. She was adopted from an orphanage many years ago, and no one knows where she came from or who let her into this world. She had to look for a donor with a matching blood type. Second, her father had a stroke from worry and died right in the ambulance. Emmy didn't regain consciousness, but she was holding his hand at the time. This morning was the last straw, and Emmy wasn't embarrassed. She sobbed and inhaled the familiar scent of valerian, and such a familiar perfume from her mother's home robe. But honey, come on, really, you can't do this. Everything will be all right. Mrs. Kate stroked her daughter's hair, though she could hardly hold back her own tears. It's not worth it, pondered the woman, the spoiled son of rich parents, a golden boy major, not a match for my smart, self-sufficient, beautiful daughter. They sat in the kitchen until late afternoon, drinking no less than a tankard of strong mint tea. At the end, they drank fresh cherry wine and went to bed. Emmy tucked into her old room, where everything remained as it had been the day she had left the threshold of her home and moved in with Darwin. That was 2 years ago. She lay down comfortably and began to fall asleep. And after all the excitement of the day, from her shift at the hospital to the alcohol she had drunk, she fell into a deep sleep. And she saw that woman in the antique dress again. She was calling Emmy into her secret world again. This time she was leading Emmy down a spiral staircase that seemed to lead to the bowels of the earth. Emmy tried to call out to her, but she kept going down. She could hear something rustling on the stone steps, breaking the silence of this strange corridor. Finally, they found themselves in front of a door with a picture of plant stalks. They were intertwined and formed an ominous bouquet. There were wormwood, nettle, and chamomile. Emmy didn't know the name of the others. Emmy counted the stems, and there were 9. The girl took a deep breath and woke up. It was still dark. A cool breeze stirred the curtains near the open window, and Emmy was drenched in sweat and breathing heavily, as if she'd run a cross-country course over hilly terrain, her chest pounding with something. Her eyes were double, and her fingertips felt as if they were electrified. She was thirsty. She wandered barefoot into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, took a cookie, and drank it in a gulp. Her head was just telling, and Emmy looked with hatred at the empty wine bottle that stood by the sink. The clock in the hallway read 4 o'clock. Suddenly, the dream came to mind. It was so vivid and believable that it seemed to Emmy like it had been real. What was that drawing on that door? What kind of woman burst into her consciousness every time? The girl pulled her laptop out of her suitcase and sat down on the bed, placing it on her lap. So, what is she looking for? Plants, symbols, signs, the woman with the ring. What nonsense. As a result, she printed wormwood, chamomile, nettle. Google immediately gave a continuation of the chain plantain, fennel, hops, gingerbread, mirris, applewood, common brews, common worms, 9 sacred herbs, and further references, Odin's conspiracy, witches, bouquet of witches, grass, black, white magic. Emmy was discouraged. What else was the whole bouquet? She decided it was all a fool's errand. Emmy put the notebook aside and threw herself on her pillow. Darwin's words came to mind. I love someone else. And tears flowed from the corners of her eyes. The day after tomorrow was her birthday. And this time, she wouldn't have Darwin or Daddy by her side. And then there was the night shift at the hospital. It suddenly occurred to her that she didn't know her birth story, her roots, her lineage, and even who had given her that ripe rye-colored hair, who had given her those huge green eyes. Sunday afternoon dragged on for an incredibly long time. At her parents' house, time seemed to stand still. Mother was cooking something in the kitchen, probably soup. Behind the wall, a neighbor's child was practicing his violin outside, enjoying the bright sunshine. There was a lot of noise from the children. My father's kind gaze, his wise advice, and his shoulder to cry on was sorely missed. They had always had a reverent relationship with their father. His death was a real blow to Emmy. The strange tingling in her fingertips grew worse as the evening wore on. And the girl grew restless. It was as if they were electrified, and touching one another was painful. To make matters worse, her eyesight and sense of smell were impaired. I must have caught a cold, Emmy thought to herself as she went to bed and covered herself with a blanket. She was shivering. The girl spent the night dreamless in a strange forgetfulness, waking and falling asleep again. Faces and strange objects appeared. And in the end, Emmy was completely exhausted. She opened her eyes. The morning greeted her with torrential rain. The crazy scents of rain and lilacs and wet asphalt wafted in through the open window. The air was generously saturated with ozone. The girl went to the bathroom and washed her hair, and then looked in the mirror. She looked at her completely exhausted, bent person with dark circles under her eyes and pale face. It was all due to stress, decided this girl as she unscrewed a tube of toothpaste. Somewhere behind the wall, a hairdryer was buzzing. The clock in the hallway was ticking. The refrigerator in the kitchen was grumbling. Water dripped from the faucet. Emmy started listening and heard sounds she never paid attention to before. Finally, Emmy brushed her teeth. She went to make coffee, but her mother beat her to it. There were 2 fragrant cups of coffee and scrambled eggs and cheese on the kitchen table. They ate breakfast in peace, trying to avoid talking about the future, much less the past. However, it decided to remind themselves with a message from Darwin. I still have your books. I'll bring them to you at work. What other books? The Handbook of Surgery. Keep it. I wanted to write to Emmy, but the prospect of seeing his face again suddenly seemed so tempting that she just answered Oak, hastily packed, and said goodbye to her mother in the entryway. The girl headed for the bus stop. It was raining, and people were just everywhere, and there was no time. She risked being late for work. As luck would have it, none of the buses wanted to stop. They were all full to the brim with passengers. Emmy felt a rush of unbelievable energy. Something unfamiliar rolled in her chest and threatened to burst out. A minibus pulled around the corner. The girl could see that the cabin was filled with people, but it suddenly stopped. The doors opened, and the young man standing on the threshold nearly fell over. However, when he looked at Emmy, he suddenly jumped down from the step of the car and said, "Miss, you are completely soaked. Please come in. I'll wait for the next one." Emmy was embarrassed and wanted to refuse, but something kept her away. Something strange. Emmy mumbled words of thanks in utter bewilderment and jumped on the vacated step. The shuttle doors closed, And the last thing she saw before that was the discouraged face of the guy left out in the rain at the bus stop. Emmy wasn't late for work. She got there just in time for the 5 minutes. Back in her office, on the desk in the resident's office, she found a bag of books. Your beloved came by, brought books. Bella, the nurse, informed her. He was mad as hell. By the way, he didn't even ask about you. He just threw the bag on the table and took off. So I won't see you. Emmy could hardly suppress the urge to cry. The day flew by at a frantic pace. Emmy paced back and forth. There were more patients than usual. Toward the end of the day, a girl was brought in from a car accident and rushed to the operating table. She had an artery injury and was bleeding profusely from her neck, while she was being lifted by elevator to the surgical ward. Emmy feverishly clasped her wound with her hands. She wished that the girl had been saved, that help had been given in time. What was her surprise when, in the operating room, she found that the wound was no longer bleeding and that it looked as if it had healed. Its edges were fused with new tissue, and it was no longer life-threatening. In total bewilderment, Emmy mechanically assisted the surgeons, trying not to look at the place where her hands had recently been. When she returned to her residency, she again turned her attention to the bag of books Darwin had brought. There was indeed a medical reference book in there, as well as a sleepwalker and several textbooks, and a strange, unfamiliar book in a thick, antique binding. The book had no title, nor did it have a year of publication. The book was written in a foreign language, Old Slavonic or Latin. Emmy didn't know anything about it, and to her it looked like a recipe book. Completely incomprehensible, the girl dialed Darwin's number. "What kind of book did you bring me? The one in the old binding? It's not mine. You know, I always suspected that you were strange, but not that strange." Bones' voice trembled for some reason. "I don't want any more of that occult crap in my house. Look, please don't call me again." Emmy hung up the phone and stared thoughtfully at the book, which suddenly seemed alive to her. The pages seemed to vibrate, and the girl never left the feeling that something very, very strange was going on. Unexpected. There are references from the internet about witches, a wreath, and 9 herbs. She opened the folio again on the first page and only now noticed the little monogram in the upper right corner. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up and stood on end when she recognized it as the same sign painted on the door from her dream. It was an intricate weave of 9 sacred plants. Her heart seemed to skip beat after beat, and silence. The room became rumbling. Unfamiliar noises were clearly audible in it. Emmy was ready to swear she could hear the rustling of her dress on the cold parquet of the residence room. When she got home, she went straight to the shower. After standing under the burning jets, she calmed down a bit and tried to find a logical explanation for everything that had happened to her that day. But no matter how hard she tried, nothing worked. Once in her room, Emmy turned on her laptop again and, opening the browser, typed 9 sacred herbs into the search box. Google brought up references she was already familiar with, and many others. But her gaze was hooked on an unremarkable one. A seemingly unremarkable entry at the very bottom of the list. 9 herbs for conspiracy. White witches and a small badge already familiar to her depicting a wreath of various plants. The girl clicked the link and began counting the alliance of sacred herbs. Wormwood, chamomile, nettle, plantain, fennel, hops, jeruja, myrrhis, applewood, common brews. It appears that they are a means to an end for the possessing power of the White Witch. They are, together or separately, the main integral ingredient for any moon-sanctified conspiracy and ritual. And they serve for the good of white magic and all mankind. They cannot be used against a person or for no good, for this prohibition is associated with black magic, a power that destroys whoever dares to disobey. The witch draws her power from Mother Earth. For all wisdom, art, understanding of the world lies within her. And much, much more. Emmy felt dizzy. Her eyelids were slipping and the rooms were spinning around her. Before she could organize the information in her head, she fell into a deep sleep. In the dream, the woman with the pale face was there again. This time, she greeted her with a wreath in her hands. Emmy wasn't scared anymore, only very, very cold. She suddenly realized that darkness had thickened around them. It had become almost blind, and the girl could see nothing but strange, burning eyes and a happy, winning smile. The woman approached and put a wreath on Emmy's head. Suddenly, everything was gone. Emmy was fluttering in her sleep. She was now hot and now cold. She was sinking, then suddenly vaporized upward. Her heart seemed about to burst out of her chest. It beat heavily against her ribs. It seemed to her that she was dying, that she was somewhere on the edge of consciousness. On the very edge of it, the old Emmy remained. On the morning of her 20th birthday, she woke up a different person, opened her eyes. Emmy felt an unprecedented rush of strength and energy. She had never felt so good in her life. Surprisingly, all the sadness, resentment, and bitterness that had troubled her the day before had dissolved with the moonlight of that extraordinary night. Her mother met her with a joyful smile and the cake she had baked for her daughter's every birthday. On the table there was a small box, tied with a red bow. "This is for you, my darling girl," said her mother, and held the box out to Emmy. "May it bring you happiness." The girl thanked Mrs. Kate warmly, opened the present, and almost dropped it on the floor. The gift was a silver pendant in the form of a wreath-like arrangement of plants. There were 9 stems. She counted them several times. "Where did you get that?" she asked her mother in a trembling voice. Mrs. Kate was immediately upset. "I ordered it from a jewelry shop. But where did you get that symbol? For heaven's sake." Emmy was close to fainting with surprise and bewilderment. Too many coincidences, too many mysteries, too many questions. It all seemed a little creepy to her. "You won't believe this," the mother excused herself, "but that wreath was a dream I had. I saw that pendant on you and decided to order it. In fact, it upset you." She sympathetically put her arm around her daughter and asked, "Is everything all right?" By this point, Emmy had calmed down a bit. "I just wasn't expecting such an unusual gift from you." She tried to squeeze out a smile. "Happy birthday. Happy birthday. Hooray." The squeals of joy nearly knocked Emmy off her feet. When she opened the door of the resident room after a warm hug and congratulations, she and her colleagues sat down to drink tea with the birthday girl brought cake. Suddenly, the girl's gaze fell on the newspaper lying on top of the files with medical histories. Emmy didn't know why, but she picked it up and started leafing through it. When she reached the classified section, Emmy caught her eye on the ornate telephone numbers beneath the small piece of text. "A qualified nurse is urgently needed at a country estate to care for a disabled resident. Payment on a weekly basis." Something very strange was going on in Emmy's mind, for as she stepped out into the hallway, she dialed the number. After 3 rings, a woman's voice came into the phone. "Mrs. Nelson's mansion." "Hello, I'm calling from an advertisement." Suddenly, there was excitement, but Emmy pulled herself together. "Are you still in need of a nurse?" "Oh, well, thank goodness. Yes, of course. Very, very much needed." The voice on the other end of the line was obviously that of an older woman. It was low, but pleasant. "Then I could come in for an interview, for instance, tomorrow. If it's convenient for you, that would be fine. I'll text you my address to this number." "Yes, please." Emmy disconnected the call and stared at the wall. The phone beeped. A message came with an address. Thoughts swirled in her head. Emmy was overwhelmed with emotion. She suddenly felt as if she touched something that would change her life forever. Her hand reached for the pendant her mother had given her, and she could have sworn she felt a strange, unexplained vibration from the cold surface of the silver. If someone had asked her the next morning how her shift had gone, she would not have been able to say a word, for the day flew by like a fog. She automatically did her job. Thankfully, the night was quiet, and she looked forward to the morning. Rushing home and changing clothes, Emmy ran out of the house with such speed that she nearly knocked her neighbor down, along with her dog. The girl quickly apologized and hurried to the bus stop. Within minutes, she reached the train station, bought a ticket at the local ticket office, and was on the train in half an hour. Her heart was beating like mad in her chest. Her throat was dry. She had never been so nervous in her life. Behind the window of the train, she saw high-rise buildings, parks, then factories. Then came cottages and farmlands, with tractors and villages scattered here and there. Finally, the scenery changed dramatically. The train rushed into a wooded area. The navigator seemed to have only a short distance to go, and Emmy wondered what could be out here in the middle of nowhere. Gradually, however, the forest receded, and the train stopped at a small station, where, sitting on a chair, two elderly women were selling sunflower seeds. The girl stepped out of the stuffy train toward the sun. She had to walk 1.5 miles from the station, and she was glad she was wearing comfortable sneakers. Greeting the old ladies, she asked which way she should go, and having received an answer, briskly walked along the path in the indicated direction. The forest was beautiful, all light from birch trees in their trunks. It breathed, fragranced, and rejoiced about something. Birds were singing everywhere. Insects were buzzing. Nature was living a full, renewed life, and it seemed to Emmy that she was at one with it. It was so unfamiliar to her to be here, in this unspoiled wilderness. Finally, after walking supposedly about 1 mile, she came across a carved leather sign that read Mrs. Nelson's Mansion. She sped up, and in 15 minutes she emerged from the woods into a huge clearing. What Emmy saw was beyond her comprehension. She had expected to see a relatively modern house of 2 stories, slightly neglected because its owner was disabled. But there, hidden from view by an alley of tall poplars, stood a huge old mansion 3 stories high. A bulky structure, it was sprawling with ivy, just beginning to open its leaves, and the pillars of its broad stone porch might have reminded her of Acropolis, but they weren't as old as the Greek monument. There were quite a few other buildings on the grounds, including modern ones. Emmy noticed a large garage, an outbuilding, stables, and apparently a carriage shed. It's like I've traveled back in time, Emmy thought. And indeed, everything around it was so atmospheric. You could make historical movies there without bothering to create scenery. When Emmy got to the door, she didn't even have time to press the doorbell before the door swung wide open and a short woman of about 65 appeared on the threshold. She had a pleasant face, and her hair was perfectly gray in a tight bun at the nape of her neck. She wore plaid pants and a light blouse tucked into them. Her look was so simply elegant that Emmy regretted wearing her favorite ripped jeans and a simple cotton t-shirt. "Welcome, my dear. We've been looking forward to seeing you." The woman gestured for her guest to enter the house. Emmy said hello and stepped into the pleasant half-light of the hallway. "Let's go into the library. It is a good place to talk, and there's a nice view of the garden. By the way, my name is Mrs. Nelson. How do you do?" Emmy could hardly keep up with her, as she led her through the spacious living room. "And I'm Emmy." "Oh, Emmy, that lovely old name," commented Mrs. Nelson to the sound of her own heels. The house was cooler than the outdoors and no less atmospheric. Time seemed to stand still here. Even the library was bright because of the huge black window, which did indeed offer a stunning view of the blooming garden. "Sit down, my dear, and I'll make the arrangements for the tea." Emmy sat down in the chair to which the woman had pointed, smiling, and she thought that Mrs. Nelson was about to take a bell from the table and ring it to summon the maid. But she took a cell phone out of her pants pocket and dialed the number. "Lizzie, will you make us some tea, please, and bring it to the library? Oh, and don't forget something delicious for our guest." With these words, she passed out and sat down in the chair opposite. For a minute, she looked at her companion in silence and with a smile. Emmy was awakened. "Yes, I've got my diploma from the Institute and my certificates from the promotion courses I've taken." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Nelson interrupted her. "I can see that you're the right man for us. Aren't you going to ask me about my work experience skills?" "You see, my dear." The woman patted her hand cheerfully. "I've been around a long time, and I know a thing or two about people. The fact is, we don't need a nurse so much as a companion. Your future ward is a very complicated person with a complicated history. Your duties will include administering physical therapy, supervising the taking of medications, but also helping with minor household chores. You may ask, why am I not doing all of this? Because the young man is 28 years old. He's just bored with an old woman like me. And Mrs. Nelson laughed. So my ward is a young man. Emmy was genuinely surprised. I thought it was your husband. Mrs. Nelson grew sad and replied, the reality is that my husband has been gone for 40 years, and my only grandson is in a wheelchair. So he's your grandson? Yes, Charles is my only relative. We don't have anybody else. She took a handkerchief out of her pocket, and it was instantly soaked after it touched her eyes. For 2 years now, he's been confined here with me. His parents died the day he became disabled. A car accident. I'm sorry for your loss, sincerely said Emmy. How awful it must be to lose your child and see your only grandchild in pain. As it happens, only women have been long-lived in our family generation after generation. My son was only 53. At that moment, the door opened, and a burly woman in her 50s appeared in the library with a huge tray. Meet Emmy. This is Lizzie. She's our cook and part-time maid. Mrs. Nelson introduced her. Lizzie places her burden on the little table and smiles broadly at her guest. How do you do? How do you do? Emmy smiled back. Lizzie, this is Emmy. She will be looking after Charles. Lizzie glanced unceremoniously at the girl and said without resentment, thank goodness. I hope at least she can do it. Our host is an invalid after all. The landlady threw a reproachful look at her, and Lizzie, ashamed, immediately withdrew. Mrs. Nelson sat down in her chair and poured the tea. This is lavender, she announced, seeing her guest inhaling the aroma. Trying to work out what Lizzie had put in the kettle. It smells amazing. Sincerely, Emmy said. Since she had left the house decently, long ago and without breakfast, the girl ate a magnificent freshly baked croissant with enormous appetite. Her companion drank only tea in small sips. She indulged her guest with homemade cookies with nuts and fragrant currants and jam. Suddenly, the library door swung open again, and a young man dressed in a cotton shirt and jeans in a modern wheelchair appeared on the threshold. Emmy's heart skipped a beat through her body, as if an electric charge had passed through it. When she saw his handsome, masculine face, with features carved precisely in stone, and deep gray eyes as cold as ice. Dark curly hair, his collar pushed back, his shirt, and his broad, once muscular shoulders slung behind his ears. He was lean and well-built. In his hands he held a book. Mrs. Nelson jumped up from her chair. Here is my grandson, she announced. Charlie, I want you to meet him. Grandma, I asked you, he said, barely glancing at Emmy, his eyebrows furrowed. His lips turned into a tight line. I don't need a nurse. Well, of course you don't. The old lady justified herself. Do you need a helper? I don't need an assistant. Charles, stop being rude. I don't care. That's not why I'm here, Emmy blurted out. It was so sudden that both grandmother and grandson turned their heads in her direction at once. I'm here to get you back on your feet. She knew it sounded silly and defiant, to say the least, but she suddenly realized that she believed it. You see, my dear, Mrs. Nelson began to answer. What kind of nonsense are you talking? Abruptly, Charles interrupted her grandmother and looked at Emmy point blank, their gazes finally meeting. I'll never get back on my feet. I don't think so. Calmly and confidently, Emmy said. She suddenly remembered the girl with the torn aorta, and it gave her strength, and she felt that familiar tingling sensation on her fingertips again. For a few seconds, they stared at each other, as if studying, guessing at something, tasting it. It was a strange first encounter. Finally, the boy tore his gaze from her face and turned abruptly to leave the library. Mrs. Nelson exhaled noisily. It seemed all right. Well, congratulations, Emmy. I thought it would be much worse. She sank heavily into her chair. There was no trace of the old smiling lady. But you shouldn't have said that, for Charles hasn't yet got over the pain of his loss and come to terms with his situation. The doctor said it was a spinal cord injury. I believe it will all work out, Emmy said quietly. And you must believe. Yes, that's right. But you see, sweet girl, after the accident, Charles lost both his friends and his fiancée, who, unable to stand being confined here, one day just packed up and left. She gave him his ring back. He's wounded in the heart, you know. Everything will be all right, Emmy said firmly. And the two women suddenly smiled at each other. The next day, Emmy sat in front of her discouraged boss, writing her resignation letter. The lines flew out from under her hand as fast as if someone was pushing her. A little less than 24 hours had passed since she had left Mrs. Nelson's mansion, but she could not shake off a strange feeling that had no name. Confusion, fear, joy, excitement, probably all at once. The 2 weeks that Emmy was supposed to work passed like the blink of an eye. She did her job automatically, filling out case histories, making rounds, helping out at her mother hugged her goodbye. I hope you know what you are doing, my girl. Emmy only nodded affirmatively. Hurry, hurry, hurry. Emmy really wanted to go back to that house in the middle of the woods. Just please call me every day, please. There were tears in Mrs. Kate's eyes. Otherwise, I'll go crazy. You're going so far away. Of course I'll write to you, Mammy. Emmy pressed her lips to her cheek and breathed in her familiar scent with pleasure. Emmy said, It's all right. The distance is only 120 kilometers. The mother cried again and let her daughter out of her arms. Mrs. Nelson met her near the alley. It was the first day of summer, and she was wearing an elegant silk dress with a bright pattern of flowers. Mrs. Nelson hugged Emmy cheerfully. The woman informed her that lunch would be in an hour, but in the meantime she could rest in her room and adjust herself. After lunch I will show you the house, she informed me. Besides Mrs. Nelson or Lizzie, a driver and a gardener lived in the house. The driver also took care of the stables. It turned out that Sokolova still kept several horses. The men lived in the outhouse. Lizzie lived in a small room under the stairs, and Emmy was given a nice bright room on the first floor next to the library. It was next to Charles's room. As Emmy unpacked, she could hear the noise of his armchair mechanism and the sound of music. Apparently, her ward was a Mozart fan. Emmy set aside the suitcase, most of which was medical reference books on rehabilitating the critically ill. Emmy began to study the room. It was decorated in silvery colors. The furnishings were modest, but modern and elegant. It was inviting because of its unassuming style. A chandelier on legs and a computer would have looked fine in it. Nevertheless, there were neither candelabra nor computer. And there was a large, comfortable dark oak bed, 2 cottonwood nightstands, a light fixture, a small closet, a small mirror, and a couple of empty shelves for Emmy's personal belongings. Emmy was delighted with the room. She changed into a neat peach-colored suit she bought in Turkey a couple of years ago, and a pair of loafer shoes. She simply tied her hair into a ponytail before opening the door to the hallway. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. She needed to be calm. A new page of her life was beginning. It's not hard. Emmy found her way to the dining room, knocked on the door, and entered. Mrs. Nelson happily rose and walked toward her. Come in, my dear. Sit down beside me. But the look of those icy gray eyes pinned her down. She stood at the door and did not know what to do. Charles was staring at her, and his gaze said, What the hell do you want here? Finally, she was able to pull herself together. Good afternoon, Mr. Charles. She averted her gaze and slowly made her way from the door to the desk, sinking into a chair beside Mrs. Nelson. Hello, Emmy. After a second's hesitation, Charles answered. That is your name, isn't it? He literally glared at her. That's right. Their eyes met again, but this time Emmy held his gaze. When would you like to start classes? Charles answered at the same moment. As soon as possible, Emmy. The sound of her name and his voice made Emmy flustered, but she quickly calmed down. You still need massages and water treatments, as well as a whole range of medications. How can you be so knowledgeable? Charles interrupted her. I studied your medical history. Then you must be aware that my case is hopeless. But nevertheless, to please my grandmother, I will do what you say. The truth is, I simply want to dispel the boredom. Emmy just nodded. Enjoy your meal, Emmy. And the boy began to eat his soup leisurely, as if nothing else interested him. Mrs. Nelson ate in silence, too, and occasionally glanced back and forth between Emmy and her grandson. And she seemed satisfied with everything. But it was hard for a girl to eat. She had barely touched the soup and was now leisurely picking at the unpalatable roast with her fork. She knew she was going to have a hard time, given the nature of the patient, but she couldn't even think of leaving. A strange unknown force was keeping her here, and she was going to find out what it was. After lunch, Emmy returned to her room and changed into her medical suit. She laid out in front of her the treatment plan handed to her from Mrs. Nelson and decided that she could start with the same one. She reviewed about 1 million videos on YouTube and medical websites. She also took massage therapy as an adjunct specialty during her sophomore year at the institute. Emmy found her mentee in the garden. He was sitting with a book in his hands, but not reading it, but looking somewhere in the distance beyond the low fence, beyond the groves. What are you reading? She broke his seclusion. 100 Years of Solitude. The young man answered. There was no arrogance, no anger, no resentment on his face now. He turned toward her and her heart thumped in her chest. She lowered her eyes to his hands with long fingers holding a thick binder. Where were you staying? I was just getting started. And I don't like Mercs. Emmy shrugged her shoulders. I'm closer to Dumas or Jane Austen. Charles suddenly laughed. Such a young lady, like you, must not yet be spoiled by the bitter experience of life. Do you still believe in princes? She came over to him and sat down on the edge of the bench, on which there was a checkered plate. Not anymore. The girl answered and smiled. But I believe in nobility, honor, generosity, courage, and destiny. So you are a romantic heroine, I suppose. He studied her with interest. At that, his face suddenly became quite different. The color of his gray eyes melted. His lips relaxed. The angry crease between his eyebrows disappeared. Perhaps, Emmy smiled. And you? He rolled his eyes faintly, as if he were pondering. I guess it depends on the circumstances. At the moment, romance is as far away from me as life itself. Or have I suddenly become serious? Then perhaps it's time I reminded you that we have procedures today. Emmy felt like distracting him from his sad thoughts. A gust of wind took her mind off it. The weather began to change. She grabbed a plate from the bench and threw her underwear over her shoulders, accidentally touching Charles's cheek in the process. It happened so fast, it was like an electric shock through Emmy's body. He, it turned out, felt it too, and for the first time in their brief acquaintance, he averted his eyes. Let's go. It's getting chilly, Emmy squeezed out, somehow managing her emotions. I'll have to treat you for a cold, too, if you don't. The boy just grunted, but let the girl lead the way into the house anyway, opening the door of his room. Emmy pushed a chair inside. Now I'll help you over to the bed, and we'll start over. I want to examine your feet. She noticed that he was gripping the chair with his hands, his fingers turning white. Emmy tried to say with indifference, No need to be embarrassed. Mr. Charles, I'm a nurse. Thank you very much, he replied sarcastically. I feel much better now. She even thought he hid a smile as he finally lay down on the bed. Charles exhaled noisily. He was extremely unaccustomed to the presence of a young and beautiful woman in his room. Ever since his fiancée had left him 2 years ago, Emmy had looked at his once healthy, strong body and her heart ached. Charles was athletically lean and broad in the shoulders. The muscles he had once trained were still visible, but it was noticeable that he hadn't exercised in a long time. Emmy shifted her gaze to Charles's legs, which looked like a rake. Muscle atrophy had already begun, and that wasn't good. Emmy finally touched his legs, but her fingers began to tingle again, and her body was shaking. She didn't understand what was wrong. Charles, too, sat as if he'd swallowed a few bricks and was afraid to breathe out anymore. Emmy felt a strange rush of energy. She began to massage his legs. She wished that someday this man could walk again. Suddenly, he stopped her. "I felt something." His voice brought her out of her reverie. "What did you feel?" She froze. "Your hand. On the big toe of my left foot." Emmy was encouraged by his words and began to massage the ankle. "Yes, that's right." His eyes glittered feverishly. "Good heavens, God. Go on." Later, as Emmy lay in her bed, she thought back over the events of the day. She was clearly aware that something strange was happening to her and to the people around her. This place, this house, the nature, the setting, everything seemed familiar to her. She saw Charles's face again. When he felt his body again, there were so many emotions: joy, disbelief, and fear. Fear that none of this was real, but somehow Emmy knew that it was true, that the miracle had really happened, and that she herself was the cause of it. And there was that long dream again. This time she was in a bedroom. A large bed, candles in a candelabra. There were two of them. A man weary with passion, and a young woman who was already very familiar to the girl. She looked at him as if the world did not exist, as if he were the center of her entire universe. His eyes were warm and smiling. Oh, those gray eyes. Emmy already knew them. "I love you so much," the woman said. "I will never love anyone else like that." "I love you too." The man leaned toward her and kissed her on the lips. "And that you will always know it." Here he took a large gold ring with emeralds as bright as spring greens off his little finger and put it on her ring finger. "Is it a promise?" she asked. There was hope in her voice. "Yes, it is my vow." Emmy awoke in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. Her fingertips were shaking. Her heart was beating like mad. She sat up on the bed and held out her hand for a glass of water. She hung her feet on the floor and fumbled for her slippers, drinking the water in a gulp. She didn't know why herself, but she opened the door to the hallway. There was no one there, but Emmy could have sworn she heard skirts rustling outside Charles's room. Her feet carried her that way on their own, and when she reached the door, she wrought it without knocking. Charles was sitting on the bed. He was agitated. Droplets of sweat covered his forehead. He didn't even seem surprised by Emmy's appearance in his room deep into the night. "Who are you?" He was staring at her point blank, and the girl noticed it. "I don't know. I just had a dream." "I had a dream too. You were there. You were in my dream." They didn't notice how the formal "you" disappeared from the conversation. There was an awkward silence. Emmy came closer and sat down on the edge of the bed. "I have a feeling you didn't just happen to show up in this house," said Charles. She didn't know what to say. "I think I've been here before. The thing is, I was taken from an orphanage, and I don't know anything about my ancestors. Do you think you might be related to me?" The guy grinned. "No, I don't think so. I would feel, I guess, just these strange dreams. It's like they're from the past." And after she was quiet, seeing Charles looking at her intently, she added, "Do you think I'm crazy?" He shook his head. "I have strange dreams too. It's like a soap opera." He leaned back on the pillow. "You know, everyone thinks there's a family curse on my family." "How's that?" Emmy thought he was joking. "It's not hard to believe, considering all the men in our family die before they have hairs. The exception was my father, who lived to be 53. But now I'm in a wheelchair, and the Nelson line will probably end with me. What kind of curse is that?" Emmy felt her feet begin to freeze. In spite of the warm May nights, drafts roamed freely through the huge house. "They say my ancestor once betrayed his love, left her for a lucrative marriage, and that girl cursed him. I see in my dreams a man with some woman. Today I realize that you look just like Sandy." Emmy was shaking. either from cold or excitement. "What did you see today?" "Tonight I saw them in bed," and he gave her a ring. The room swirled around her. Emmy couldn't say a word. Her fingertips burned with fire. Mysterious, complex puzzles began to form in her mind. She looked at Charles. He was obviously waiting for her to say something. But instead she moved closer to him. Their eyes met, but now she saw much more in them than she had before. In them was the history of the family, lived through 2 centuries of misfortune, tragedy, and loss. Emmy knew she had to kiss this guy, or she simply wouldn't survive. He appeared to be ready for it, for his hand suddenly rested on the back of her neck, and he drew her closer. Their lips touched. At that moment, all the memory of their past lives flooded into their veins. Their minds raced with images of the people who had been involved in their birth, scenes of their last moments, their feelings, their fears, their hopes, their love. Especially vividly, they saw the 2 who had started the whole story. Emmy didn't notice how she found herself lying next to Charles on the uncomfortable orthopedic bed. Something wonderful was happening at that moment, for she could feel his masculine strength, the strength of his embrace, and some kind of strong and unbreakable bond between them. It was not the invalid lying beside her at all. It was a healthy, passionate man. Perhaps they were dreaming, but it was so thrilling, so sweet and incredible, that Emmy allowed herself to surrender to the will of her senses. Suddenly breaking all out from its long confinement, morning reached the room through the tightly curtained windows with a timid ray of sunlight. Somewhere in the stable horses were roaring from the people's room, and a croaking rooster was singing his song right under the maiden's bedroom window. Charles awoke first and feverishly began to pull on the clothes he had thrown on the night before. "Emmy, my dear, I must go now." He leaned toward the sleepy girl, who stretched sweetly, wrapping her arms around his neck. For another moment she pressed his face to her chest. Charles noisily inhaled the scent of her hair. With an effort, he slipped out of her embrace and deftly jumped onto the windowsill. Charles vanished into the light of dawn. Emmy opened her eyes abruptly and realized that the events of the night were real. Mr. Charles's heavy, masculine hand rested on her chest. The hair on her temple stirred with his steady breathing. Lying beside him felt cozy, as if she had found her home after a long wander. But more importantly, he began to feel something. Though his entire lower body was paralyzed, she thought she could feel it a few times when she touched him. The girl cautiously climbed out from under his arm, dangling her legs off the bed. Emmy fumbled for her slippers on the floor and stood up, throwing back the blanket slightly. Charles was still sound asleep, and she set about masking his ankle. She concentrated so hard that waves of wild and powerful energy began to emanate from her. Her fingertips became more sensitive. It seemed as if she went into some kind of trance. The universe suddenly shrank and seemed to embrace her, encouraging and helping her. "God, I'm awake. I can feel your touch." Charles' excited voice brought her out of her stupor. She looked up, but her gaze passed his face and stopped where the woman stood near the curtain. The sun's rays did not reach her. She was safely hidden in the shadows, but her eyes burned. So Emmy couldn't look away. She knew this woman, had seen her many times, and felt her presence. It was she who had been left in bed by the man who had been dreaming of the girl this morning. Suddenly, the uninvited guest raised her hands to her face, and Emmy nearly lost her senses. They were charred to the elbows. She even smelled the smell of burnt flesh. Why did it outrage her? "What's the matter with you?" Charles grabbed Emmy's arm, and the figure in the corner melted away as if it hadn't existed. There was no blood on the girl's face. She was paler than chalk. "Nothing," she answered slowly, and guided her hand up her leg and impressed on her calf muscles. "Yes, and here too." He immediately, forgetting everything, looked at the girl joyfully. His eyes sparkled. "You know, it's like a miracle." Emmy tried to find the right words. "You are a miracle, but please don't tell anyone until we're sure." Charles looked like a little boy now. It was so touching. Emmy reached out and brushed a disobedient dark strand of hair away from his forehead. A lot had changed over that night. Something had emerged for both of them that brought them very much closer together. I won't tell anyone. Now I have to sneak back to my room and clean myself up. He nodded silently and pulled her to him. It seemed so natural to Emmy that she didn't think of stopping him. She only put her hand on his chest and kissed his cheek. "Don't be long," Charles murmured, reluctantly releasing her from his embrace. "I won't be long," Emmy promised, and slipped out the door. Half an hour later, they were already sitting in the dining room, eating with gusto the sandwiches Lizzie had made. Mrs. Nelson chattered nonstop, but she could not hide from her eyes the change that had taken place between the young people. "You both look very happy today." As if by the way, she remarked and took another sip of tea. Charles just smiled and cast a meaningful glance at Emmy. After breakfast, they practiced in the gymnasium for a long time, then asked Lizzie to make coffee. They went out into the garden, where it was sunny but quite cool. A wind was blowing from the river. Rain was coming. They sat down in the gazebo, which was covered with ivy, the leaves of which were already wide enough to hide the visitors to the gazebo from view. Emmy carefully covered Charles's legs with the plaid. "Come here." The boy called to her as she prepared to sit down next to him on the bench. "You sure?" She looked at him cautiously. She looked down at his frail knees. "Absolutely," said Charles. "I'm not as weak as you think." "I didn't say that," Emmy said with a smile. She carefully sat on his lap and hugged him for about 5 seconds. They just stared at each other, as if they hadn't seen each other in a very long time. Then a long and intoxicating kiss followed. It all happened so fast that they hadn't had time to get used to each other yet. "You do realize we need to talk, don't you?" Emmy asked, pulling away from his lips. "I agree." The boy smiled and put his arm around her waist. "It's obvious that we're connected by some kind of story that was tragic. And if you know who you are and who your ancestors are, unfortunately, I don't. The place where I was before I was adopted gave almost no information except that my parents were dead, and my real last name was not Hykins, but Peterson." Emmy exhaled. "Actually, I have some thoughts." Charles took her hand and put it to his lips. "Once upon a time, my family, had neighbors. The Petersons, I think. It was about 200 years ago, but then the estate and all the buildings burned down. How it happened, I don't know. I only know from the words of my father, who heard about it from my grandfather. The whole Peterson family died in the fire, along with their servants. They say it was arson, but no proof has been found. You can look in the archives of the local museum." Suddenly, a picture of a woman with burned hands popped up in front of Emmy. "Charles." She looked into his eyes. "I had a dream in your bedroom this morning, and then the woman from our visions was in my bedroom." "What do you mean?" The incredulity in his voice struck her as hurtful. "You don't believe me." "I do. I just can't figure it out. Whether it was her or her ghost. I don't know." The girl looked away and asked, "Have you ever had the feeling that someone or something was present near you?" His look confirmed her guess. "Go on. I'm listening to you." "Anyway, this morning in your room by the curtain, I saw a woman with long arms. I even smelled something burning. It might be a clue, but I don't know who she was, if she belonged to the Peterson family, or if she was just related to them. Perhaps she was burned there or hurt. After all, only her hands were burned." Charles thought about it for a second, and then he said, "In those days, all births and deaths, as you probably know, were recorded in church books, a kind of registry book. So those books might still be there. We could try to find some kind of clue." "Are you saying this church is still intact?" "Well, intact is an understatement. It's abandoned. I used to play there when I was a kid. How are we gonna find those books? I'm sure they went bad a long time ago. And what are they gonna tell us? I think it's worth a try." "Can you drive?" Emmy answered affirmatively. Darwin had insisted on it once, and now she was grateful. An hour later, they loaded the wheelchair into the old car, sat Charles in the passenger seat with the help of a groom, and drove down the dirt road toward where the woods were turning gently into groves. When asked where they were going, Charles replied that he wanted to show the girl the surrounding countryside. As they drove, he told her everything he knew about the family's history. This church had once been very wealthy. Even though the entire parish was made up of the inhabitants of only 2 estates, however, one day all the property was stolen and destroyed. The icons were burned. There is some talk that something was left in a hiding place, but this is most likely just a fantasy of the locals. And the books, where could they be? Emmy maneuvered deftly down the dirt road, in even more hidden hiding places, I think, or the wall niches they used to build in every church. How do you know all this? The girl looked at Charles with surprise. I studied history at university. Actually, I'm an archaeologist, and I've been to many excavations. She was so excited, she said, that she was surprised at him. Meanwhile, the grove came to an end, and they came to a plain out of a cave. There was a ruin in the center of it. A strange feeling gripped Emmy. It was as if she had been here before. There was a figure standing by the ruins. She couldn't tell who it was from afar, but she thought it looked familiar. She drove another 30 meters and stopped the engine where the road ended and the narrow path began. The figure disappeared. There was bush all around, umbrellas sticking out in places, brambles, wild bushes stretching their clutches, ready to protect the place from uninvited guests. Emmy and Charles looked at each other. It was quite clear that a wheelchair had no place here. What was I thinking? Charles slapped himself on the knee in anger. I should have known. It's okay. I'm going crazy. Emmy unbuckled her seatbelt. No way. Charles grabbed her hand. I'm not letting you go out there alone. What could possibly happen to me? She tried to laugh, but it was a nervous laugh. I noticed the woman you see. She scares me. I'm afraid she might hurt you. Emmy's eyes sparkled. She won't hurt me, the girl said confidently. She wants to tell me something. She opened the car door, but Charles grabbed her by the arm. Wait. You must know that I won't survive if anything happens to you. Be careful, and I'm warning you, if you're not back in half an hour, I'll crawl after you myself if the baby carriage doesn't make it. Instead of answering, she pressed her lips to his mouth, then jumped out of the cabin. Looking at the retreating figure along the path, Charles exhaled wistfully and mentally crossed his eyes to her. Emmy cautiously made her way through the dryness across the grassy path to the ruins of the church. With the back of her head, she felt a presence. The woman was clearly here, but Emmy wasn't scared. This place was strangely comforting to her. As she approached the door, she struggled to open it and immediately found herself in a small room with elongated windows and rotted floorboards that had almost fallen to the ground. The desolation was so intense that Emmy was confused. Where to look? The girl cautiously moved forward to where the analog was usually located, and now it was empty. Some bird slid noisily out from under the leaky roof, sending cobwebs and dirt all over Emmy. She shook her hair back frantically, for she was terrified of insects. Something fell right into the neckline of her shirt, and she tried to get it out, but accidentally caught the pendant chain, and the pendant slid down. Emmy was frightened out of her wits that the pendant would fall under the floor, and she bent down and searched among the dry leaves for the debris that was piled all around her. The pendant lay right there, on the iron manhole cover, safely hidden from sight under the old planks. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she realized the hiding place. Everything going on seemed unreal to her. Open it. A voice sounded right above Emmy's ear, so close that Emmy almost fell over. She looked around frantically, but there was no one behind her. For a moment, she regretted coming, desperate to leave the place. But overcoming her fear, she pulled the manhole cover. It would not open. The girl reached out again, using all the strength she was capable of. At last the lid gave way before Emmy, and a small recess in the floor appeared. It was lined with a sort of cloth, the colors and composition of which were impossible to make out. On it lay a pile of yellowed books, a jar of some kind of liquid, and a huge silver cross. Emmy stared at it all, hesitant to touch it. An inexplicable revulsion suddenly came over her. A hand rested on her shoulder. "Take it." The girl closed her eyes. "Who are you? And what do you want from me?" "I want to take you away." It was a groan. "What am I supposed to do?" "Take it." Emmy reached into the niche when she heard another voice. The hand that had been squeezing Emmy's shoulder disappeared. The new voice Emmy heard was that of Charles. Apparently, he was beginning to worry that she had been gone a long time. The girl was careful not to hurt herself, taking out her books and pressing them to her chest. She hurried to leave this strange place. She caught Charles frantically trying to push the wheelchair out of the car. The door was open. He was going to get on the ground somehow. "What are you doing?" Emmy knew her question was inappropriate, but her thoughts were in such disarray that she couldn't think of anything better to do. "Emmy." Charles saw her. "Where have you been for so long?" "For how long?" He looked at her point blank. "You've been gone over an hour." Emmy was in shock. She felt like she hadn't even spent 10 minutes in that ruin. I'm sorry. I just didn't realize how much time had passed." At that moment, Charles finally saw that she hadn't come back empty-handed. "I don't believe it. How did you find them?" The guy held out his hands, and Emmy was relieved to give up her burden. "You were right," she answered and got behind the wheel. "They were in a hiding place under the floorboards." "But how did you find the hiding place?" Charles carefully examined the cover from the first page. "Completely by accident." Emmy tried to make it sound as carefree as possible. A little birdie helped. She made a smile. About who she'd talked to in church, the girl was silent. He'd had enough news for now. As she started the engine, she looked at Charles. He was perusing the notes. His dark hair was down to his collar, his shirt, his face. His lashes fluttered as he squinted his eyes often. Trying to make out the faded ink, the girl suddenly realized that she had fallen completely irrevocably in love with this guy. Just like that, in a couple of days of getting to know him. Or not. At first sight. Since that very meeting in the library of the mansion 2.5 weeks ago, he had felt her gaze and taken his eyes off her reading. Their eyes met, and the world around them ceased to exist. It must have been the real magic for which the planet spins. Two souls met each other, and nothing else mattered anymore. "I was afraid trouble had happened to you. How would I have been able to live then? But it's all right, isn't it?" Emmy moved closer to Charles and stroked his cheek, where a barely noticeable stubble had appeared. "I'm with you. I'm right beside you. I kept thinking there was someone else in the church, and I couldn't protect you. And that's unbearable. Let's go home." The girl left light kisses on his lips and put the car in reverse. After she'd somehow turned the unwieldy car around on the narrow road, she pressed the gas pedal, and they drove toward the estate. A worried Mrs. Nelson came running out to meet them. "I've been worried sick." "Grandma, we're fine. We're alive and well, but just incredibly hungry." Charles tried to guffaw. "Don't do that again." She looked reproachfully at her grandson's companion. "It could be dangerous." Emmy smiled guiltily. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Nelson. It won't happen again. Your grandson is a very literate, interesting storyteller." The time flew by. The old lady has mellowed. "Yes, my Charles knows the history of these parts very well." Emmy answered and noticed Charles, with the help of the groom, getting into his chair and hastily hiding their find under the seat. Once in her room, Emmy picked up her cell phone and saw 5 missed calls from her mother. She suddenly felt very embarrassed, so she dialed the number. "Hello, Emmy. Why aren't you answering?" "I was about to go to your mysterious castle with a police squad." "Mommy, it's okay." The girl tried to calm her down. "There's no need for the police. You haven't called since you got there. You haven't even picked up your phone today. It's just that my phone was in my room charging, and we were out walking, me and my ward." "Right. I'm waiting for the details. And please don't do anything stupid." Emmy chatted with her mother for another 40 minutes, naturally silent about her relationship with Charles, the church, and the mysterious woman who was keeping her awake. After dinner, Emmy was again very tired. Again, her body responded to her touch. This time in the knee area. Charles rejoiced like a child. They barely waited until all the inhabitants of the mansion had gone to bed. After that, Charles found himself in Emmy's room. The girl helped him onto her bed and made him comfortable. She herself, picking up a church folio, sat down next to him. Charles began to read the chronicle, which dated back to the year 1006. Soon, they were confused by names, surnames, and family ties. "What are we looking for?" sighed Emmy. "Patience, Emmy. All this takes time. I'm thirsty. It's so stuffy today." She jumped off the bed. "Do you need anything?" Charles looked at her wistfully. "You have no idea how much I need right now." "I mean it." She smiled and sat down next to him. "But I believe that one day we will make all your dreams and wishes come true." "I believe that now, too." Charles took her hand and pressed his lips to her palm. "Now I would like a sandwich. A simple, mediocre ham and cheese sandwich." It was dusk in the hallway, but the girl didn't turn on the lights. It might have awakened Lizzie. She crept into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and drank it in a gulp. Emmy was already spreading butter on the bread, preparing to cover it with a scrap of cheese and a piece of ham. But suddenly she realized that she was not alone in the room. The girl slowly turned her head toward the window. The woman was there. She was standing looking at Emmy. "Find me." A groan escaped the ghost's lips. "What?" She didn't understand. "What should I look for?" "Where?" The girl was desperate to help. 1825. Remember, 1825. Emmy repeated the combination of numbers. Was that the date of birth or death? The vision melted away as suddenly as it had appeared. Emmy's hands were shaking, and her fingertips seemed to have been in sulfuric acid. What on earth was that? She quickly finished her sandwich and raced back to her room. "I know what to look for." "Look, 1825. "What?" Charles doesn't understand. "Why would you think that?" "Just trust me." Emmy sat down next to him as he went through the pages looking for the right date. "There. I found it. On May 15, 1825 at Peterson Manor, Mr. Andrew had a daughter named Emmy. Was it a coincidence? The girl wondered. Charles continued to read. August 2, 1825 AD, a son was born to Mr. Nelson, whose name was Charles. The young men looked at each other. They understood everything. That's where the story begins. It was their ancestors, Miss Emmy and Mr. Charles. They loved each other. The puzzle was beginning to piece together. Read on. Emmy looked at it very carefully. It goes on to say that in 1842 Emmy was given in marriage to Mr. Kingsley, who passed away under horrible circumstances. Right on the night after the wedding, Charles looked at Emmy. What do you think of that? I think this woman had something to do with his death. Emmy answered. It's not certain, of course, but I have the feeling that she wasn't an easy woman at all. There was a power about her that I could feel all the time. And maybe, she paused and looked at Charles. There's that power in me too. What do you mean by that? I think she was a witch. All these symbols that I see in my dreams, these herbs, and these dreams in general. I mean, it's a real vision. And Emmy was silent, not daring to say anything, which greatly alarmed Charles. He looked at the girl. Tell me. She was in the church. She spoke to me. And you didn't tell me anything about it. Charles became very angry. She could have hurt you. The boy grabbed Emmy by the arm. Do you understand that? She's not going to hurt me. She wants me to help her. And I think this woman is my ancestor. She may be the Emmy that the book says she is. Charles looked at her intently. This girl radiated such energy that his heart began to beat harder. From the first glance, he knew she was special. And it wasn't just that his body began to literally wake up to her touch. He felt like he had known her all his life. What had happened when they had first kissed had only confirmed that. But now it was up to him to figure out what had happened 2 centuries ago after all. Why was his family under this terrible curse? And that there was a reason for all these deaths of men in their family. Charles was now certain, his own dreams proving it. Charles. Emmy distracted him from his thoughts. I must visit the Peterson estate, or rather, what is left of it. He thought for a moment. There's a vacant lot, a couple of ruins. It's all overgrown with grass. And let it be. I really need it. Charles suddenly tensed up. So wait, there's still a record of 1851. Mr. Nelson's son Charles, by the way, married Bella Peterson, the daughter of Mr. Peterson. It turns out he married our Emmy's sister. What does all this mean? Maybe they were just lovers, Emmy suggested. And then he married her sister, and she was betrayed by them. If she also had supernatural powers, she might well have cursed her former lover. Well, that made sense. Charles agreed. Suddenly, he remembered something. By the way, upstairs in my grandfather's office, there are some documents. Very old some. A merchant's certificate. They're in a display case like a museum piece. I saw them when I was a kid. And then I guess I forgot. But maybe they'll give us some more information. Emmy perked up. Maybe. But how do you get there? He hesitated. The young man looked slyly at his companion. It may surprise you, but there's an elevator in the house. They fell asleep together on Emmy's bed. The girl could feel his heart beating under her palm, and she felt good and peaceful. But soon the dream came hard, scary. No, please don't. The man was tall, thin, dragged her by the hand somewhere down the narrow stairs. No, don't do that. She was tearing and crying, clinging to the walls of the dungeon. But he dragged her, gripping her firmly above the elbow. You are my shame. You are the spawn of hell. The man looked at her with hatred. You are a witch. So are your offspring. I wish I had strangled her when she saw this light. No, please, no. Her eyes rounded with horror as they finally stopped at the wrought iron door. Don't, but he had already unsigned the lock with his free hand. Something clicked. He grasped the heavy deadbolt, which slid away with a terrible grinding sound. The door opened, and a dark chamber stood before them. The walls, floor, and ceiling were lined with stone, and the chamber was icy, gaping like a grave. The man pushed her there forcefully, and she fell. Sit here until you are dead. She rushed toward him in terror, but he was already closing the door. No, please don't leave. Please don't. Father. No. Emmy jumped up on the bed. She was very frightened. What had happened? I was dreaming again. Dawn barely dawned in the east, and the sky in the wide opening of the window. And the walls of the bedroom had already managed to turn a delicate pink. No, this was not a dream. The girl was sobbing and couldn't breathe. The horror of the unhappy Emmy Peterson, which was undoubtedly the woman in her dreams, was transmitted to her. It was a nightmare. A gruesome episode, but it was over. Charles put his arm around the girl, rising awkwardly on the pillow. What did you see? Tell me about it. And she, choking on her sobs, told him what she had seen. She died there in that dungeon from hunger and cold and fear. Do you understand? Why? I do not know. I don't know. It's so terrible, inhuman. That's why she can't calm down. But what does my family have to do with it? Charles wondered. Did she kill someone who was my ancestor? That's for us to find out, Emmy muttered. After calming down a little in his arms, after a morning of gymnastics and all the necessary procedures, Emmy and Charles took a long walk in the garden. Catherine set breakfast in the gazebo, where they ate thin pancakes with jam and drank strong tea, enjoying the silence of the late May morning. Mrs. Nelson had gone into town on some urgent business, which was a good thing, for she was adamantly opposed to Charles going up to the second floor. Charles and Emmy entered a small elevator hidden from view between the pantry and the kitchen. Emmy and Charles found themselves on the second floor, where the girl had not yet been. After passing through several doors, they found themselves at a wide wooden door. Mr. Nelson's office was quiet, and all that could be heard was the buzzing of the wheelchair mechanism and the pounding of their hearts. The display case was indeed there. In addition to the documents on the special subs, there were several pages of appropriations, a mouthpiece with traces of tobacco, an antique flintlock, and a silver set. Apparently the Nelsons were avid smokers. The key must be here somewhere. Charles opened his desk drawers and pulled out a small key on a chain. I feel like Nancy Drew. Laughing Emmy. She was my favorite heroine as a kid. The girl was terribly nervous. Her fingertips were trembling again. She suddenly distinctly smelled a strange odor of dampness and decay. Charles pulled some documents out of the display case. They were old receipts, dated 1870s. One of them caught her eye. 1851. The Nelsons bought their maid from the Petersons. Violet the cook with her infant daughter. This was strange, for last night, as they were reading the church books, Charles found an entry about this maid. A girl was born who died 3 days after birth. Then what child was with her when she was sold to the Nelsons? They found no other valuable information. In the corridor where they went out, it got cold for some reason. Charles sneezed, and a slightly lost, uncomprehending Emmy pressed the elevator button. For some reason, the doors didn't open. The girl tried again and again, but to no avail. There is a ramp on the stairs, Charles reassured her and turned the chair around. All right, just wait for me. Don't go down yourself. She shouted after him. What's going on? She heard a frightened cry. The next minute she saw him hurtling toward the stairs. Emmy dashed after him, but didn't have time. Did the chair and Charles crash down the stairs? No. In an instant she was down beside him. Charles was lying on his back, showing no sign of life. Emmy leaned over him, but caught a movement out of the corner of her eye and looked up at the corner of the hallway, where the bright crimson skirt was disappearing. How could this have happened? Mrs. Nelson sobbed in the hospital corridor. Where were you, Emmy? I was nearby. But the chair was obviously faulty. The girl hardly listened to the woman. All her attention was fixed on the guy lying in the room behind the huge glass on the hospital bed with a lot of tubes and gauges. She has to go in there. She has to. Why did you go to the second floor? It was highly irrational. Why? Charles wanted to show me my grandfather's office. How to live now? Mrs. Nelson wailed. If Charles doesn't recover, I can't live. Why should I? After all, the nurse gave her some valerian, and the poor old woman fell asleep right on the narrow couch in the hospital corridor, where Charles had been brought immediately after the accident. Waiting for everyone to disperse, Emmy quietly crept into the room. Pain and regret flooded her. She saw a pale, handsome face, arms lying lifelessly along his body, and bruises on his shoulders. Charles's eyes were tightly closed. He had not yet regained consciousness. Emmy cautiously crouched in the chair beside the bed and took his hand in her palm. The hand was warm and very familiar. The girl put it to her lips and cried, "Wake up, please. Wake up. Don't leave me, please. I need you so much." Suddenly, she wiped away her tears and closed her eyes. She concentrated. She imagined a wreath of 9 herbs linked together. The bundle of powerful energy she felt within her slowly began to untie her bound legs. Her arms suddenly became heavy and sensitive. Heat spread all over her body, down to the tips of her fingernails and hair. She took Charles' hand again and began to whisper the words that came to her mind. It was an ancient language, unfamiliar to her, accessible to the few living on earth. Emmy felt her energy transfer to him. She gave it generously to him, for he needed it more. The girl awoke to someone stroking her hair. She was sitting on the floor beside the hospital bed. Emmy looked up and almost died of happiness. Familiar gray eyes were looking at her. A hand, quite recently lifeless, helpless, ran over her blonde curls. The girl rose to her feet and rushed toward Charles. She pressed her hand to his cheek, found his lips, ran her fingers through his dark hair. "Are you awake?" "Oh, thank God. I was so frightened." He kissed her passionately, as if his life depended on it. A nurse on duty caught them in the act. "Oh, for heaven's sake. Young men, young lady, what are you doing here? Leave the room at once." Then, apparently realizing that the patient was getting better, she ran to get the doctor. At the same moment, Mrs. Nelson burst into the room and rushed to her grandson. A minute later, the doctor arrived. Emmy went out into the hallway and returned her thoughts to the mansion. She knew that what had happened to Charles had not been an accident, and she was going to put a stop to it. When the turmoil around Charles had subsided, she went in to see him again. Mrs. Nelson was dozing in an armchair by the window. Charles saw Emmy and held out his hands to the girl. Emmy, trying not to wake the old lady, quietly snuggled up to him. "I have a surprise for you," he smiled and threw back the edge of the blanket, exposing her ankles. Emmy watched him move his fingers, and tears of happiness flowed down her cheeks. She took his face in her palms and kissed him. "I knew this would happen. I believed it would. In those few days, it seems like a lifetime has passed. I think it's all thanks to you." "Seriously," said the guy. "You're my guardian angel." She laughed softly. "Charles, I have to go, but I'll be back very soon." "Where are you going?" Charles got worried. "To see my mother," Emmy lied. "Since I'm in town." His face relaxed. "Then say hello for me." "I will." She paused at the doorway and glanced at him again. The sight of him made her heart ache. She realized that life would never be the same again. Everything had changed. She herself had changed. Sending Charles an air kiss, she slipped out the door. She arrived at the mansion around 11 p.m. Alex's driver dropped her off near the porch and went to the garage. The only window in the house was lit in the kitchen, and Emmy went straight there. She hadn't eaten anything. Lizzie had been sitting at the table all morning, drinking tea and watching television. When she saw Emmy, she woke up. "But how is our boy?" Mrs. Nelson called and said he was awake. "The worst is over," she said, and sank back in her chair wearily. "He's all right. Do you have anything to eat?" Lizzie patted herself on the head. "Of course, you're hungry. Poor girl. I'll be right with you." And Lizzie hurried to the refrigerator. Soon, there were pancakes, mashed potato patties, Olivier salad, and a slice of apple pie. Emmy smiled appreciatively. "I can't eat it all," she said. "Come with me. I'm on a diet." Lizzie reported back. "Eat as much as you want." The girl nodded and began to cut the cutlet with a knife. She had already planned a visit to the ruins of the Peterson estate for the morning. There, she believed, she would find a clue. And there was that dream again. Everything was on fire. The woman was thrashing around, unable to find a way out. She could hear the screams of people dying in that infernal fire. She could feel their fear. The smoke didn't let her breathe. Sparks danced in her hair. She laughed. Emmy Peterson stood aside. The flames didn't touch her. She was showing Emmy her palms. They were in the ground. The girl jumped up on the bed. The pendant hanging from her neck was turned to her head in the furnace. It burned her skin. With a frantic movement, Emmy snipped the chain and tossed the sinister jewel to the floor. It was her. It was her. She's the one who set the fire. She's the one who destroyed the manor. But how? She was in the dungeon, unable to wait any longer. Emmy jumped out of bed, and even though it wasn't yet dawn, went to the bathroom. She washed her face with ice-cold water, brushed her teeth, and put on jeans and a t-shirt and soft tights, and went out on the porch. The sun was slowly peeking out from behind the horizon like a huge plate. How beautiful the sky was, colored softly pink. It was chilly, and Emmy put on her jacket. The stable boy was smoking on the bench before he went to clean the stable. "Good morning." Emmy said hello. "Good morning, young lady." An older but still rather sturdy man answered. "What are you so sleepy about?" "I love early walks." Emmy lied and headed for the gate. She walked steadily, as if she knew the way, past the familiar grove. She walked for a long time along the winding path through fields overgrown with grass and weeds. It is strange that so much land is empty. The girl pondered. Some sixth sense told her she was on Peterson's land. She was home. After walking another 300 meters, she saw the ruins of an old house. There were quite a few of them. They were lost among the densely growing birches and would have been unnoticeable to the inattentive eye. A strange excitement gripped Emmy. She swallowed the lump stuck in her throat and headed deep into the grove that had become memorial to her ancestors' history. Emmy saw the woman immediately. She was standing outside a small suburb. Her hair was loose and her dress was stained with dust and cobwebs. She remembered the girl. "What do you want?" Emmy sobbed. "Come," the woman whispered. Though her lips did not move, they crossed what had once been the courtyard, down the hill to the river. There she stopped, looked under her feet, and disappeared. Emmy walked over to that spot and found herself standing on something hard under a layer of moss. There was a hatch hidden in the ground. Emmy felt a sudden bout of nausea. The girl squatted down. She already knew what the hatch was. She knew what or who she would find deep underground. Would she have the strength and courage to make it to the end? Would she be able to cope with the evil that was increasingly felt in this place? Suddenly, Charles's pale face flashed before her. Of course she could. She must. They need answers. Emmy found a piece of iron in the rubble and began to peel off the earth and moss from the hatch cover. After a good half hour, she grasped the heavy ring with both hands and gave it a tug. The lid would not budge. It was too big and heavy. Finally, Emmy got down on all fours and leaned her palms on the ground. At that moment, the girl felt a powerful energy fill her entire being with every cell of her body, nourishing her with unprecedented strength. This time, the hatch opened immediately. She saw the dark, musty, and damp-smelling spiral walkway and switched on her cell phone flashlight. Emmy bravely stepped down. She recognized the place, for she had seen it twice in her dreams. Such fatigue, pain, despair suddenly came over her, with which the earthen walls were saturated. A crypt, she thought, as she stepped onto the first step. Reality mingled and visions appeared. I loved him. Oh, how I loved him. A voice sang above her ear. She saw a very young Emmy dancing at the ball with Mr. Charles. They looked at each other fondly and tenderly. They seemed to be no more than 16. Then a young Emmy and an elderly man with a big mole on his cheek are married at the altar. Then in the bedroom, in bed, the frightened girl, her husband looming over her like a cloud. He takes her by the arms, but she pushes him away so hard that he flies across the room and hits his head on the table, blood splattering on the parquet. Here is the grown-up Emmy in bed with her lover Charles. Then Charles and Bella's wedding, at which Emmy stands by the door and whispers curses. She does not notice that her father is staring at her. There is fear in his eyes. Then Emmy, with her big round belly, is screaming hysterically on the bed. The baby is about to be born. It's a girl, and a woman in a big white apron takes the baby girl. Emmy begs to keep her, but her father locks her in her room. Then comes a vision that Emmy is already familiar with. The father locks his unhappy daughter in a dark hole underground. She's thrashing around in there, crying, wagging her hands on the stone floor, on the walls. Suddenly, about the curse of the Nelson family. Charles was in danger, still in danger. She must save him. After all, she is Emmy's heiress, also a witch. She knew this as firmly as she knew her name. Now she knew her origins, her roots. It all made her head spin. When Emmy came back to reality, there was a door in front of her. It was pitch black all around. The girl had no key, of course. She reached out her hand and lost the familiar image on the cast iron surface. God, a cast iron door. How the father was afraid his daughter would break out. Suddenly, her fingers felt something cold. The girl discovered it was a key. She wondered who had touched it last. Emmy pushed the key into the keyhole. With an effort, the girl turned it, and a grave, ominous cold pelted her as the huge door creaked open. For a second, the girl stood, hesitant to enter, but a voice ordered her forward. She obeyed. It was a chamber scary, dark, and icy. There was stone everywhere, the smell of fear and death. Emmy saw it immediately. It was a small skeleton sitting near the far wall. Tears suddenly spurted from her eyes. She felt unbearably sorry for this girl, who for 2 centuries could find no rest, who had suffered a horrible death here, in darkness and loneliness, and all she wanted was happiness. Instead, she was betrayed by those closest and dearest to her. "I want to go," the figure whispered. Emmy leaned over the skeleton. It looked at Emmy and longing glittered in its eyes. "Bury me." Emmy suddenly remembered. Why did you try to kill Charles? The curse had already done its work on him. The figure shook his head. "I saved him. If I hadn't, he would have died. So you didn't mean him any harm." She shook her head again. "Bury me," she repeated. Emmy moved closer to the remains. Something glittered in the flashlight's light. There, on the stone floor of the crypt, among the white phalanges that had once been fingers, lay an emerald ring. "The very gift of Mr. Charles. Take it. It is yours." Emmy lifted the heavy piece of jewelry with trembling hands. Energy radiated from it. She could feel it in her bones. She was used to it, but she could feel it in her bones. She took off her jacket and carefully tucked the bones into it. Every last one of them. Her face was wet with tears. No one in the world deserved to die like that. After she had barely made it out of the dungeon, Emmy squeezed her eyes shut. The bright daylight hit her eyes. The sun hung high in the sky. How much time had she spent in the crypt? She looked around for a suitable place. "Take me to him. Take me to him," a voice whispered. A figure stood beside her. It was translucent and immaterial, but for the first time the expression was peaceful. Emmy knew where Emmy Peterson's ancestors were buried. It was the old cemetery behind the church, where she had once visited. Gently clutching her burden to her chest, the girl paced toward the church. She paced and paced, feeling the ghost's presence behind her. At last the ruins of the church appeared, and beyond them an old cemetery, overgrown with weeds. There were at least 100 tombstones, and Emmy began walking between them. Suddenly, near the fallen fence, she saw a familiar figure. It was the grave of Mr. Charles. The figure nestled against the slab and closed her eyes. Emmy couldn't hold back the tears again. She managed to find some sort of shovel in the church. Grabbing a cross from the hiding place, the girl returned to the grave. She chiseled the hard, cold earth for a long time until she was able to dig a small hole. Into it, she piled Emmy's remains, along with her jacket. The girl crossed herself briefly. She buried the hole and put a cross on top. The figure stood beside her the whole time. "Thank you, honey," Emmy heard. They stood looking at each other. 2 women, the past and the present. Emmy looked down at the pendant hanging around Emmy's neck. "You don't need it. Leave it here." The girl obeyed. She carefully removed the piece of jewelry and, placing it on the grave, sent it into the earth, raising her eyes in search of Emmy. She suddenly realized that she was gone. Emmy returned to the mansion tired and exhausted. It was already getting dark. Lizzie met her in the hallway with an angry look. "Where did you go?" "They were going to call the police." "I went for a walk," Emmy answered. "All day?" She nodded affirmatively. The last thing she wanted to do was talk. "Honey, are you here?" Mrs. Nelson came out of the library to meet her. She was glowing. "Good evening." Emmy said hello. "Are you smiling?" "We have wonderful news, Emmy, just wonderful news." "You were right." Charles was beginning to feel his feet. He was moving his toes today. "I am infinitely glad," sincerely replied the girl. "How is he now?" "He's wonderful. He has to rehabilitate, but he will be back home very soon. But don't worry, your job will stay with you. It's gonna be hard for him. You must be hungry." "No, I'm not hungry." Thank you. Emmy mumbled faintly and fell into a deep sleep when she got to her room. 3 months later, Charles was using crutches to get around. Emmy couldn't forget the moment when she went to see him in the hospital and showed him the ring she had found in the crypt. She had to tell the whole story from beginning to end. "Emmy, how could you go there alone?" "I had to go for you, for everybody." Charles squeezed her in his arms and looked into her eyes. There was so much tenderness in them, so much warmth, that the girl could hardly swallow the lump in her throat. "Emmy, I love you. Be my wife." Those words took Emmy back to the 19th century. And now she and Charles are dancing in a waltz. Their reflections flicker in the ballroom mirrors of the Peterson estate, and such peace and tranquility was in her soul at that moment. 2 years had passed. A nightlight burned in the small nursery. The girl, weary from the day's events, slept soundly in her crib. She was the daughter of Emmy and Charles. Today she was named Isabella, and around her little neck glittered a golden cross. She lay peacefully on her pillow. The woman's translucent silhouette was barely visible near the window. "You will be happy, little one." Quietly the voice said goodbye. "You will be happy, for the curse has been lifted forever."